Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast. And this time we didn't actually want to have concentrations on generating actual code or doing a live demo or let's say making something fancy to happen from a code perspective. Rather this kind of a architectural discussion when you should be using which model within a SharePoint. Because we do have different kind of techniques, different kind of models which you can use when you're customizing your SharePoint in SharePoint Online or in on-premises. So what would be the right model for you? So what is the benefits and disadvantages, or advantages and disadvantages between the different models? My name is Esa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today is Waldek Mastercards. Waldek, will you do the intros?
Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastercards. I work at Pencor, and today we'll talk about building SharePoint customizations, when to use which development model.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Before we actually move into the actual topic and covering the individual models, what we have within the SharePoint from a customization perspective, just quick introduction on SharePoint Patterns and Practices. So SharePoint Patterns and Practices is a community-driven initiative, open source initiative, which is providing code samples, guidance documentations, monthly community goals, case studies. And the areas are in the SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Adding, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs. Both SharePoint Online and then obviously on those elements which are suitable in SharePoint on-premises. The PnP is owned by the SharePoint Engineering, but we work together with community as an open source initiative to share all of these assets for you to get advantage and get a starting point for your customizations and for your projects. Now, let's actually move back on the today's topics. And today's topics really was around the different models on the SharePoint customizations. And one thing what we want to have super clear when we are talking about these individual models is that all of these models are absolutely fine. We should not say which of the model is the best practice, because the best practices always depends on your requirements. So what are you planning to achieve? What is the right model for you in a short term and in the long term? So the key point when you're looking into these options is really to understand what are you trying to achieve from a requirements perspective, from a business, functional and technical requirements perspective, and then choose the right model for you. So the world is definitely not black and white from that perspective. We should not go and say, hey, this model is the best practice. Well, that's not quite the case. It really depends what are you trying to achieve.
So, in other words, nobody didn't move the cheese, and we can still use everything that we learned in the past.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's actually a good factor as well, because one of the factors to make the right decision is that if we do have, let's say, a development team which do not have experience on some certain model, maybe that is actually a good factor to take into account. Do you want to use that model or that approach within your customizations? And that really comes down on designing the right architecture for your customizations as well. Not just making the, hey, somebody in the internet said this is the best and coolest thing ever. That's not a valid justification for spending time and designing your software based on whatever model you're choosing from. Good. So let's actually concentrate on the individual models. And what we wanted to do is that we wanted to kind of go through these models one by one. And we're going to start with something classic. Maybe classic is actually a wrong, even a wrong term, because, well, kind of classic. It is an old stuff. So SharePoint classic solutions, and with classic solutions we mean WSP packages, as in farm solutions or sandbox solutions since 2010. And really, we as a SharePoint developers, I've built like hundreds of WSP packages, which many of are still in production. We've been there and built this since 2007. We introduced the feature framework and solution package model as part of the SharePoint 2007 release, and then people have been adapting that quite nicely and quite fast as part of their SharePoint deployments. It's now, however, when we're recording this, it's 2017. So actually the model is 10 years old. And so it's been actually surprisingly well taken, because people are still using the SharePoint Classic Solution model as the primary way of customizing SharePoint, especially in on-premises. And one of the obvious advantages is that there's a lot of existing resources and guidance available in the internet, random blog posts, and also in the Microsoft MSDN site as well. And there's a native Visual Studio tooling available for that one as well since 2010, which actually got slightly even more better in 2013.
And also there are books.
Oh, and also there's a lot of books.
Don't forget that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's physical books and there's electronic books on this one. So really validated data on that from that perspective. And one of the, I would say, the key advantages of using the WSP packages, especially if you're using a farm solutions when you have access on the server side as well, is the fact that the customizations are hosted natively in the SharePoint servers. So you don't actually need to have additional infrastructure. You don't have to, the additional hosting doesn't cost you additional maintenance and operational impact and so on. Now, that was the advantages. So let's concentrate on the disadvantages and why we as a Microsoft, we are kind of gradually moving away from the WSP packages and really absolutely supported in on-premises as a farm solutions, sandbox solutions, in online as a declarative sandbox solutions. But really the reason why we're moving away is the complexity and they're not flexible enough and they're not aligning on the future direction of the SharePoint or the future way of doing customizations in a web in general. The sandbox solution code behind is no longer supported in SharePoint Online. That support was discontinued back in autumn 2016. In on-premises, that actually still works if you enable the code behind engine in your on-premises farm. Farm solutions, absolutely understandable. They're not supported in SharePoint Online, so that option is completely closed as a model to customize SharePoint Online deployments. Even though you would be in on-premises, the farm solution actually have a lot of kind of let's say downsides or disadvantages. They directly impact on your farm operations and maintenance and, for example, downtime. I've spent countless of weekends updating business critical production deployments of customers. Started on Saturday morning and then something went wrong with the new version of the farm solution and then trying to fix the issue before the Monday morning actually starts. The modern customizations don't do this. Yes, you might theoretically break individual pages or individual sections, but you don't actually take the farm down like the farm solution did. So there was a really kind of you needed to trust what the farm solution contained. And also from a backup and restore perspective, you needed to make sure that your content databases are in sync with the backups of your customizations. Because if you need to restore your data or databases, you need to make sure that you have matching farm solutions deployed as well. Really, the SharePoint Classic solutions, they did and do require deep SharePoint specific knowledge to truly master. If you use the Visual Studio tooling, it might feel simple and the wizards, hey, I'm just clicking through stuff here. But that might actually fool you in many times, because even though it's Microsoft generated wizard in Visual Studio, it wasn't really super optimal from a future maintenance and versioning perspective. So some of the choices which was done with the Visual Studio wizards are not actually good for a future maintenance of the customizations, like the fact that it's by default creating custom list templates when you're creating a custom list or so on. There would have been alternative options as well. And really, one of the last kind of disadvantages on this is that the investments in the farm solution will increase the future costs of moving to SharePoint Online. And maybe you haven't even considered moving SharePoint Online. Maybe you're thinking, yeah, we're not planning to do that within the next 5 years. Fine, but will your SharePoint deployment be up and running within 5 years in on-premises still? Or what if there will be change in the VP level of your company and somebody wants to go to the SharePoint Online? It's an awkward decision or awkward discussion then that, oh, well, actually the customizations are blocking us to do so. Or we would have to do a big transformation project to make that happen. Any old horror stories, Waldek, from your side on the WSP packages?
Well, actually, no. So for all this time, I've built only 2 of them. No.
Really?
That's not true.
It's hard.
No, so actually, so in the past, originally, I built a lot of internet sites, and all of that you could only do with farm WSPs. And like no one else, I know what works, what does not. And actually, with regards to the tools are there, and over time they got better and better. But the thing was that you could always do so much more, and none of that, or not all of that, was exposed in the tools.
Sure.
So tools only got you through the first step of adding new artifacts, creating them. But at some point, you really had to understand how it all works in order to be able to fine-tune them to your exact needs, as opposite to, as you said, just use a default, which might be then a bad choice in the longer run. So you really had to understand. You basically had to read all the books that were there at the time in order to fully understand what consequences each choice you make might have in the longer run.
True. And quite often you actually didn't even realize that until you faced the consequence in 3 years.
Well, every one of us failed at least once with it, right? And that's how we learned over time what does work and what does not work. And that's exactly from where these books come from, right? And these posts and all of experience that we carry on from 2007.
True. Absolutely. Good. Let's set the WSP packages on side for a while, and let's move on to another model, which we can use in a SharePoint as a customization model as well, which is the SharePoint Adding model, which was introduced back in 2013, or as part of the 2013 release. And now counting the years, it's actually almost 5 years from that time as well, which is actually pretty terrifying. The time flies when you're having fun. But really, one of the key objective of the SharePoint Adding model was really to decouple the customizations from SharePoint Farm. So kind of really concentrate on the fact that the customizations cannot take the SharePoint Farm down, and they do not compromise the SharePoint Farm. So you are essentially hosting your customizations outside of the SharePoint in the provider hosted adding platform, or as in the browser when you're using the SharePoint hosted model. And really, the same model works across the on-premises and SharePoint Online. Sure, there are some small differences here and there from an authentication perspective, unless you're using the low trust in on-premises as well. But basically, the same architecture design, basic approach, can be actually used in both sites. Really fundamental, let's say, benefit out of the adding model as well. The emphasis is more on the generic .NET and JavaScript development models. So essentially, all of the samples, all of the guidance what we were providing was on the .NET provider-hosted adding implementation side, or in the JavaScript development. You really theoretically could have actually used, let's say, whatever third-party or alternative technologies as well, but it got really difficult, or it is difficult right now. Adding model is still absolutely used. Provider-hosted add-ins can be easily taken advantages of cloud services. So as an example, if you're hosted in Microsoft Azure and you have a provider-hosted add-in, it can easily access machine learning or service bus or whatever goodies we want to actually consume from the Azure. And still really important thing, which will be there in the future as well with the adding model, comparing to the other options as well, is the security isolation. Adding model actually approaches the whole thing in a way that the customization is requesting the needed permissions, and you give them permissions, and then it's a combination of the end user permissions plus the permissions which have been granted for the adding. So there is an OAuth security isolation, and the customizations are commonly executed if you're thinking about, let's say, the web part experience, they're executed in an IFrame, in an isolated domain, which then falls on the disadvantages of the SharePoint adding model. Because with SharePoint, the web parts are pretty pretty important thing in SharePoint. You want to have those things, what the end users and content editors are able to put on the page and configure as they wish. And with the adding model, the adding parts, they've been pretty limited. The stuff is running in an iframe. It doesn't scale. There's no responsiveness. All of those additional challenges which have been bothering us for a while with SharePoint adding model. It also has SharePoint hosted add-ins have a limited application lifecycle management capabilities, and that really refers to the fact that if you have, let's say, 100,000 sites where individual add-in has been installed or maybe not installed, if it's a SharePoint hosted add-in, only way you can actually upgrade that add-in is to go to that site and manually upgrade that one by one. Technically, that does apply also to provider-hosted add-ins if the provider-hosted add-in would take advantage of the add-in web, which would be foolish, and let's come back on that one in a second. You don't want to, by the way, do that. Don't do that. Storing data in the add-in web is problematic. Really a big thing which we need to understand, because now if you have a SharePoint-hosted add-in or provider-hosted add-in and you're storing data in add-in web, the add-in web itself is created when the instance of an add-in is added to the site. When somebody deletes the or add-in or app from the site, the add-in web is deleted, which as a consequence means that all of the data is gone. And you can't, well, right now, luckily we do have recycle bin capabilities on the site level as well, but there's a fear that you might actually lose all of the data, and you can't access or export that data easily when it's actually stored in the add-in web. So that's definitely not the most recommended option to store in the data. And also from a disadvantages perspective, provider-hosted add-ins require external hosting, so you need to think about where do I host my stuff. If you're familiar with Azure or other cloud services, it might not be a big thing. In on-premises, that usually requires additional servers, and that might be a challenging thing. On-premises adding model setup requires additional effort as well. So this really relates on the OAuth and the trusting model with the add-ins. Especially if you're using a high trust model in on-premises, that might get complicated. Actually, it isn't super complicated if you know that stuff, but it might feel really complicated when you're setting up the add-in model in on-premises. Now let's kind of talk about this one in general. So a few things, kind of a few high-level recommendations on this one. First of all, kind of a touched that already. SharePoint hosted add-ins are always in add-in web. The problem with add-in web, first of all, is that you can lose the data. Storing data in add-in web, not a good idea. The second layer is really the SharePoint hosted add-ins themselves. The remote APIs exposed for the JavaScript are highly limited. So if you're not super familiar what you can do with the SharePoint hosted add-ins, it might feel like an awesome approach. I don't need to actually host my stuff anywhere. But then you start implementing stuff, and then you realize that it's a JavaScript. You don't actually have any backend processes, capabilities. You can't really do anything above the site itself, not even in the site collection level. You're kind of really super limited on the browser experience. So SharePoint hosted add-ins not necessarily the best thing for you to choose from. So the recommendation itself would be more around using then the provider-hosted add-ins without the add-in web, if possible, if you are choosing the SharePoint adding model as the chosen path. Anything you want to add on the discussion, Walter?
Yes, actually, the iframe is actually both a pro and a con, right? So
absolutely.
The cons, as you said, it does not scale. It's separate from the rest of the page. It requires you a cross-domain call because the contents of the iframe live on separate domain than the rest of the site. So you just cannot easily reach out from that to the rest of the site. Now, the pros are actually the fact that whatever lives inside the iframe is separated from the rest of the page.
True.
So in other words, imagine that you would have an API that's secured with OAuth. In the iframe, you could get a token and be sure that no other element on the page will access that because you are inside an iframe. right? So you would be able to do it more easily than, for example, if you had a script that runs as a part of the page, because at that point, every other element on the page would be able to access the token. Right, so it's not bad, but it has some pros to it, but also cons, right? So
Absolutely.
These are definitely things that you have to take into account whenever you choose an approach, because the fact that you might sometimes want to explicitly choose to build an add-in because it's separated from the rest of the page. So definitely keep that in mind. Oh, right, and don't store anything within the add-in web.
Yes, we mentioned that quite a few times already, but obviously, and one thing maybe on that one, and maybe somebody is like, no, wait, I'm actually implementing SharePoint hosted add-ins to the store, and that is maybe an exception to the rule. So if you actually are implementing add-ins which are coming from the store, then maybe in certain scenarios you could store something in the add-in web, because that's the model for the ISVs and the add-ins in the store. But if we think about this from an enterprise development perspective, that's highly limited. It could be problematic, and the story isn't really quite out there for the time being. Now, inside of the SharePoint engineering, we are actually going to do investments on the adding model. So we are looking into improving the adding model, let's say pain points, or fixing those pain points, so some of the pain points during this calendar year. So you'll see actually additional capabilities, additional advantages or capabilities or features in the adding model during this calendar year in both online and in on-premises as well. But
so we said a few times that you should not store the data in add-in web, but if you should not do it there, where you should do it?
Good question, actually, which we didn't answer. Awesome point. So, especially when you are doing, obviously, if you are doing SharePoint hosted add-ins, which isn't really the optimal case for the adding model, but if you aren't doing SharePoint hosted add-ins, if you can actually request the manage or full permissions if you are in the enterprise world, and you can store the data in a host web. That would be one way to do the stuff. If you're in a store, those permissions right now, as we record the video, are not available in the store add-ins. Now, the real scenario and the most compelling scenario is actually use provider-hosted add-ins and then store the data. If it's a file or asset, you can still store it in SharePoint. But if it's anything else, the data which is actually list in a list format or a relational format, you can actually store that really, really easily in the provider-hosted add-in side, rather than put it in the add-in web, which somebody can accidentally delete and then all of the data is gone. That's a horrible story from that perspective. So the horrible story is the fact that somebody can actually kill the add-in web or uninstall the app. But the good story is that with provider-hosted add-ins, for example, in Microsoft Azure, you can really easily use the SQL Azure or Blob storage or whatever to store your data. Hopefully that did kind of make sense. Wandering around on the answer as well. Cool. Moving along on the options. So what about the alternative options? So one of the options which isn't actually that often explained or covered within the books or in the internet, there are some material on this one as well, is the single page apps / externally hosted apps. And in this context, the single page apps does not refer to SharePoint hosted add-ins. This refers to the implementations where you essentially have, for example, Azure website, which is then using the remote APIs to connect to the SharePoint, get the data, and render the stuff out. And in these cases, you do have full flexibility on choosing your own technology stack, because you can actually secure alternative. It doesn't have to be Microsoft technology, and you can still secure that access using Azure Active Directory security settings. You have also full flexibility on the user interface. On the downside, obviously, is that you need to implement the full user interface by yourself, because you can't take advantage of anything in SharePoint. But it gives you whatever you want to do. And then you can still access the data in SharePoint and then surface and aggregate the data any way you want from SharePoint or from Microsoft Graph, as an example. External hosted apps, in this case, they can be scaled independently from SharePoint, which, by the way, applies also for provider hosted add-ins, but it's a slightly different approach. Really, the key difference is whether we register the app. Are we registering that to the Azure Active Directory or using the classic SharePoint UIs? You can secure and access additional endpoints with Azure Active Directory. So when you are creating this app registration to Azure Active Directory, you can actually choose which are the services to which this app can actually access, or which are the endpoints where the app can access, which is a really cool thing. And you're able to delegate the authentication process completely to Azure AD. Even though you would be implementing your stuff using, let's say, just Angular, single-page Angular app, you just delegate the signing, the Azure AD, and then you get the access tokens, and you can actually concentrate on the UI. On the advantages side, cross-platform development, so you can do this model using whatever technologies what you want, not just Microsoft technologies. And then you do have that similar kind of a security isolation as with adding model. The details of that security isolation is slightly different, but the same rules apply. You are giving that app specific permissions what the app can actually do, and those are being, let's say, those are absolutely being followed when you're calling back on the SharePoint. And obviously on the disadvantages side, which ones we didn't go through, you are fully responsible of the implementation. You cannot actually take advantage of anything in SharePoint. It's not just a single piece in the SharePoint UI. You actually need to take care of the whole UI implementation. And then these are hosted externally from SharePoint. So you need to really, there's implications on that one from a maintenance and operations perspective. So that has to be taken into account as well. Anything we want to elaborate on this one, Waldek?
So I have actually two things, right? So externally hosted apps, those are actually apps that can run on your phone, your client apps, web apps, basically everything that runs anywhere. So that can be an embedded app on your phone, single page app, client application, whatever it is, right? Just an application that needs to connect to SharePoint online.
True.
And another thing that I wondered as you talked about it, is this only for SharePoint Online, or could you use the same approach in one way or another with on-premises?
One way or another, yes, for on-premises as well. Obviously, the authentication model would be slightly different in on-premises, but sure, we could have a ASP.NET application in on-premises, which is then using the on-premises authentication process to get access on the on-premises SharePoint.
Cool.
So, absolutely.
Yeah, so over time I've built a few of these, and I really like the approach. And for some things, it made perfect sense that I own the UI, because I could go anywhere I wanted around it, and I wasn't locked down to using particular master page or a div. I could use anything I wanted, and I've built quite a few times application with Angular where I owned the whole UX. And it would scale, it would work on a phone, it would be responsive. I could do anything with it. And with OAuth, I could connect to AAD, and with that, get access to SharePoint or even Exchange email, calendar, anything.
True.
Right? So this is really powerful approach whenever you have the requirement that you have to build application that might not feel like a part of the portal, if you will.
True. Absolutely. Good. Moving on the options. So the last and the logical option, what we're going to talk about, obviously, is the SharePoint Framework. And right now, the SharePoint Framework, when we're recording this one, we are in release candidate status with the client-side web parts. And there will be other components in SharePoint Framework as well during the calendar year of 2017. But let's concentrate on what does it mean for the time being and how the SharePoint Framework is essentially working right now. So advantages advantages on SharePoint Framework. Well, the customizations are executed in the context of SharePoint page, and this actually gives a lot of flexibility on scalability, on rendering, on implementing the functionalities. You're not actually tied into the, let's say, an IFrame like with the adding parts. There's no complex permission model, and I will come back on that in discussion in a second, because there is no OAuth model with the SharePoint Framework applications. The tenant administrators, they need to still approve. So somebody needs to approve that adding to be deployed or being available within the tenant or within the on-premises farm in the future. But there's no complex permission model to consider from an adding or app perspective or SharePoint Framework app perspective. There is a consistent user experience across this one, especially if you use the components and controls which we are providing from Microsoft. It's obviously up to you if you're going to do that or not, but it improves your development productivity enormously. Cross-platform development, so it really doesn't matter how you're doing development. Waldek is using a Mac, I'm using a Windows. You can do this in Linux. It doesn't really matter, because this is actually, let's say, the open source tooling based approach, which is more and more, it is industry standard for web development nowadays. And the SharePoint Framework has native support across different devices, essentially meaning that when you are implementing your client-side web parts using the existing assets which we are providing, that client-side web part will just magically by itself, without any additional gimmicks, align and resize itself to any device where it's used. Well, obviously, unless you do fixed white tables in your web part, which would be foolish. But anyway, that's a different discussion. On the disadvantage side, kind of mentioned the permission model already. So it is the SharePoint Framework application client-side web parts in this case, or in the first case, they run with the permissions of the end user without additional permission model. And this is really the reason why the tenant administrator has to approve the app to get deployed, because the JavaScript which is executed from the page does not follow any OAuth model. That could be a challenge, or that might not be a challenge, but it's a typical model, especially even with adding model, if you have embedded JavaScript on the sites. And that's been a really, really classic way of doing that. So people are embedding JavaScript to script editor web part or user custom actions or JS link. So exactly the same experience from that perspective. SharePoint Framework introduces completely new development model for SharePoint with new tools and libraries to use. And this, no doubt, is one of the shockers for, let's say, in quotes, classic SharePoint developers. I've just learned how to do feature framework. I'm just learned how to build and create my DDF files for my solution manifests. But now we are introducing a new model, which no doubt there is a learning curve. But the tooling and the model and the development experience, what we are doing with SharePoint Framework, is exactly the same how you would do development with Facebook or whatever third-party systems. So the key advantage of investing on the learning the model is that, hey, now I know how all of this other world is actually doing development. I'm no longer, as a SharePoint developer, I can actually do this other development as well. Or at least you have the starting point to do that as well. And that's a really key advantage. From a process perspective, the SharePoint Framework does no doubt require new guidance and policies for development process. So you need to think through, how do we do development? How do we do source control? How do we do, that would be aligned on the existing models. That's not that different. How do we do deployments? How do we manage our deployments? Who's going to approve the deployment and all of that? So it's a different thing. You need to think through the process for your company as well. What am I missing? What am I forgetting, Waldek?
Well, so the one interesting thing that we didn't talk about yet is the fact that SPFX is only the UI part. Imagine that you would want to build a web part that needs to do some additional operations. Imagine creating a site, or maybe creating few sites, deploying a list. It's not a thing that you would want to do in browser, because if someone closes a tab, moves over to another page, that process would stop. So you have to have some other place, or an API, or application or process that is able to do that independent of the web part that actually lives client-side on the page, right? So SPFX is only one part of the whole solution that you would build. Right? You will probably need more the richer solution you want to build.
True, no doubt. And then you have to choose the server-side model, what you want to use. It could be C# Web API, or it could be Node.js hosted in Azure, as an example for SharePoint Online. And from your client-side web part, or Azure Functions, or there's multiple options. And then from your JavaScript, you're just poking that to start as a backend process, and absolutely suitable model. That's a really good point. This is only the UI part of the story. A lot of the stuff what we, for example, used to implement as an adding model implementation hosted in the let's say Azure website, absolutely still valid. We need that stuff because then we might have implemented a web job or an Azure function or whatever functionality your provider hosted adding has been using. The SharePoint framework is modifying or modernizing the UI layer, not that backend system. So that's a really, really important thing to realize. Yep. Good. So we've gone through those 4 different models. 4 models to rule them all, and probably sooner or later there will be additional models, and there will be, or we come up with variations, and then we called it 5 models, or 6 models, or 7 models. It doesn't really matter. All of this, actually, technically, when you think about the SharePoint framework, it is actually something which you could have been able to do already with sandbox solutions, or actually before that in 2007, just hosting the JavaScript, and in the JavaScript you're hitting web services endpoint. What we're doing here with SharePoint Framework, as an example, we're just modernizing the models and processes and implementation options, what people have been able to do already in the past, and modernizing that and aligning that with the industry standard. And that's a really the key point. I wouldn't consider, well, we can consider the SharePoint framework as a new model, but actually it's an evolution of the approaches what people have been using anyway. Plus, it's actually giving us a lot of benefits as an API layer as well when we start implementing client-side web points. Good. So, like mentioned, kind of 4 different models. They are overlapping between each other quite often. We're mixing them, but let's go them through as a summary on a one page, which probably helps on comparing them between each other. So we have the WSP packages, and yet those are mainly farm solutions or sandbox solutions. The support in cloud, it's debatable. Yes, you can actually still deploy individual assets using declarative sandbox solutions, meaning sandbox solutions which only have XML or assets in them. But what it means also is that from a developer perspective, you need to actually have a deep knowledge on a SharePoint internals, because, well, especially in a sandbox solution case, you need to consider what happens if you need to update something. How do you update the stuff, or which of the elements you actually use so that you're not actually causing yourself challenges in the future, and there's multiple aspects. The flexibility marker there, we were actually spending quite a lot of time figuring out, what do we call this? Let's call it flexibility. But it actually refers more on what we can do with this particular model, and what's the future roadmap of that model as well. And with WSP packages, we're not really significantly investing on them anymore. It is what it is. It's mainly for deploying assets on SharePoint. And obviously in a farm solution case, yes, there might be server-side code as well. But we are not evolving that as such in the future either. Now, the next model which went through was adding models, which the key point was decoupling customizations from SharePoint. That was really the key challenge which we were addressing with that one, comparing to the farm solutions. And it provided the security model for the customization, for managing customization permissions. Yes, we did have a kind of the web part experience, but that was the adding part, which was limited, so it wasn't really optimal. And additional operational maintenance required, because if you do adding model in a real way, in the enterprise scale, you are falling back on the provider hosted adding model, and that's where you need to think through where are you hosting your stuff. Flexibility is fair, and the future roadmap is that we're investing heavily, well, I wouldn't say significantly, heavily, massively, but we're investing on the adding model as well. We're trying to address the key pain points with that one as well, because it is absolutely an option from a security isolation perspective, as an example. The third option which we went through was external apps, single-page applications hosted outside of the SharePoint. And that is actually decoupling customization from SharePoint as well. One of the advantages is that you can bring your own technology stack comparing to the adding model. Technically, theoretically, yes, in adding model, you can use alternative technologies as well, but it's much more difficult than with the external apps and a single-page applications registered using Azure AD. Mainly because Azure AD guys are actually helping these other technologies to use that model as well. It has its security model, and it requires a custom implementation of the user interface, which is a one consideration because the stuff is actually hosted outside of the SharePoint, so you need to implement the additional stuff as well. Supported in Office 365, flexibility is actually bigger than with that one than with adding model. And the reason why we're saying that is mainly because when you are doing registration with Azure AD, native Azure AD, you can actually do same permission models, but you can actually give additional permissions for these apps as well. So you're able to say that this app can access Exchange, Outlook, whatever LOB systems and SharePoint. SharePoint add-ins are technically isolated only on SharePoint side, unless you do funky stuff in Azure, as an example. And then the final option was SharePoint Framework. So the customizations are running as part of the SharePoint page. They do, and one of the key points to address is the flexible web part experience is part of the SharePoint Framework. Because with adding model or external apps, people maybe with adding model and app part, people are not happy with the fact that, yeah, this isn't flexible enough. I'm going to use a script editor web part. I'm going to use user custom actions for embedding my JavaScript. And that's really the what we saw from Microsoft perspective. And now the SharePoint Framework is giving us more, let's say, railed way of implementing exactly those scenarios, and more easy way to implement them as well, a more standardized way to implement them as well. It runs under permissions of current user because it's JavaScript running in the permissions of the browser. But one of the key advantages is that this is actually industry standard model. You can take advantage of Knockout, React, Angular 2. It doesn't matter. You're using the open source tooling, how people are doing customizations outside of SharePoint as well. Now, the flexibility, obviously, from a WSP is limited, add-ins fair, external apps SPA is good, so slightly improved from adding model maybe, and that's because of the additional API surface, which is easily available. And then with SharePoint Framework, the flexibility and future roadmap is absolutely looking excellent, because that's where we're investing heavily right now. But to be fair, like Waldek mentioned, quite often, you are not just choosing to use SharePoint Framework. You still need to have a web API or whatever server-side component, and that SharePoint Framework is calling that web API. So this is definitely not a black and white discussion. But those models and those patterns and those practices, they will be defined, and many of them are already defined, and we're making them easier to consume in the future as well. One thing maybe to mention on the slide also is the cost impact, short and long term. If you just look, the WSP packages $3 and then the SharePoint Framework $1, the first reaction for somebody might be, no, but I need to learn so much new stuff with SharePoint Framework. Absolutely, that's the short term costs. Now the problem with, or the challenge, let me switch to consulting language. The challenge of the WSP packages is really the long term impact of those XMLs and long-term impact of a WSP package or safe site as a template or a model. People don't quite realize the impact until then they hit those problems sooner or later. SharePoint Framework, that's a future-proven model. Short-term cost, yes, you need to learn new stuff, you need to spend some time on learning that, but then a long-term, that's a highly beneficial model, and that's future-proof. That's the model what we use internally in SharePoint engineering as well. We build our all new web parts using the SharePoint Framework as well. Same model for you as it is for engineering, and that's a really cool thing. A lot of talking. Waldek, anything you want to add on this slide? Sorry.
I don't think you left any room. Perhaps one thing to keep in mind that whenever we say that one approach is limited, the other one is excellent, we take into account a number of things, like which stack can you build on? Is it easy to scale? Is it easy to host? Can you build it only in C# or can you do it in any language on any stack you want? How easily you can reach out to other things like the Microsoft Graph, right? So we take a number of things into account and try to come up with a total score, if you will, which approach makes sense or which gives you the most options.
True.
Right? And as you said, often you will need more than one approach combined to build solution, because you might have a piece that is exposed in UI and then piece that runs as an operation in the background processing the data, right? So, and it would in the past they had to you only had one model to do it, WSPs. Then we got add-ins, so we had two approaches. Then we got three with external apps, and now we actually have more tools in our box to choose from. And the key thing is, and I guess that we covered that on the next slide, right?
Yes, we do.
Which is maybe the good time to choose to move to, which is all of these approaches are still available, and it's okay to use them. The most important part is that you do not look at which approach is the most modern or the hottest one, or about which approach people talk the most. The key essential thing for you to understand is understand what you are trying to achieve and choose the model that will support you with that the best, including what your team can do, how efficient you are. Right? Because if it will take you 2 years to build something fancy in SPFX, nobody will use that because you will be too late. Right? So you have to have a number of things. You have to take a number of things into account and fully understand which approach is the best match for you today.
Absolutely, absolutely, and also the fact that quite often you're mixing those approaches between each other. So, like the story of a client-side web part calling in a secured web API, which is actually implemented using, let's say, Adding model or ACS or Azure AD. So for connecting back as an app-only call to SharePoint Online. So this is not a black and white discussion. Obviously, analyze your requirements. Make sure that you understand what you want to achieve, and then from a selection of different approaches, choose the one which is fulfilling or the best suiting your existing model. And that's the right thing to do when you're doing the customizations, no doubt. Cool. I think it's time to close up. We had a pretty long discussion, no live demos, but I think you guys guys and girls have seen quite enough of the demos with WSP packages, Adding model, and single page applications, and even SharePoint Framework implementation. So having this kind of an open discussion on what's the good thing and what's a bad thing, we thought that it would be highly beneficial. But really, think about the fact that these things are not black and white. There's no one single best practice for SharePoint development in the future. You need to consider the options. You need to understand and select the right one which is suiting your business requirements. That's the right rule to follow. Anything else as a final words, Waldek?
Peace on earth.
Peace on earth, yes, absolutely. Excellent. Thank you everybody for watching, listening, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Bye-bye.
Bye.